Well, I'm glad you're here. Welcome to In Pursuit with Case Clay. I'm Clay Bryant, and this is Miss Tony Stribling. They are our sponsors at Rogers Barbecue in Hogansville, Georgia. And we talk about some old cases that I've been involved in and had some luck with solving. And today we're still working on some old cases. And hopefully we'll have some news on some of those pretty quickly. Had some developments in the last little bit on a couple. And but today we want to talk about probably the most famous cold case in Troup County history. And that was the case of Klinkscale. He disappeared in 1976 without a trace. And there's been so much conjecture and about what happened to it. It actually took almost, I would say, took the status of an urban legend.
It did. Mm-hmm.
And but the night in particular, Klinkscale was a young man. He was going to Auburn University. He was working at the Moose Club as a bartender in LaGrange, and but he was traveling back and forth and actually had a dormitory down in at Auburn. And from the night he disappeared without a trace, the longer it went without any word about anything again, because of his associations and so forth, there was just, I guess you could say, it was conjecture as to what happened to him. There was some fairly strong evidence that he had been involved, started to get himself involved in some things that probably were counterproductive to him. And one of those things was, and some folks that I have talked to that told me that were at Auburn University at the time, that Kyle was furnishing them with a little bit of marijuana. And back in '76, that was, it ain't like it is today.
No.
But again, because of some of the associations that were acquainted with that trade back in that day, it just because again he just completely fell off the face of the earth, and there was just a lot of conjecture about what happened to him. Well, the case was, again, it acquired the level of being an urban legend in this part of the country. Everybody was interested in what happened to Kyle Klinkscale, and there was, I don't know if the folks that came forth with information and whatnot, as late as day before yesterday, I had a guy call me that had information on the Klinkscale death that was totally, it would have been an impossibility. And if you're an investigator, you learn that there are some things that people will tell you, and I don't know what the desire is for them to do that, but they just want to inject themselves in a position to where they're in the middle of a case, and sometimes it is so counterproductive. I've used this analogy a lot. You could tell one of those people, man, there was a train robbery last night out in the Big Springs community. And the answer to that was, I saw the whole damn thing. And the sad part of that is it thwarts your investigation and leads you down the wrong road sometimes. And usually those people, as time progresses and the more, I guess, attention they get, they enhance the story and enhance the story and enhance the story. And by that time, law enforcement's kind of gotten into the point where they're following what the guy says, and if they have a theory in what happened, then they start building the guy up toward their theory.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Klinkscale case, I've had a little luck with some old cases, and hopefully I'm gonna have a little more with a couple. But in 2004, I think it was, I got kind of invited out of the Klinkscale case. And knowing what I know about it today, I'm kind of glad I did. Because I had my own theory about what had happened to him. And a lot of that theory was based on the fact that at the time, they knew what they said they knew. Well, if you look at what has transpired since, what they said they knew was an impossibility.
Let me tell you what I heard. You know, I'm a bit younger, and I'm from the Valley area where we all worked in Auburn or Opelika. And for everybody out there that doesn't know, Auburn is in Alabama. He worked in LaGrange, Georgia. Was the interstate even built back then?
It was.
The interstate.
It
So
was.
he could have had a straight shot from LaGrange hitting I-85 south to get to Auburn.
Mm-hmm.
And but back in that day, there was still this underlying group of people that were out there called the Dixie Mafia.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very real thing, specifically out of Phoenix City, Alabama. And I had heard that they thought that he had gotten involved with them somehow and maybe heard something and was, you know, going to be killed by him. That was one of the big things that went around for the longest time.
Well, and the fact that he completely dropped off the face of the earth without a sign.
Right.
That story kind of took over.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, that would be the only excuses that anybody would have, that the car's been gone. And what, the car's gone, he's gone.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes stories like that, when there's no answers, they kind of take wings and fly.
Yeah.
And this was a case that happened.
And in,
You know,
in one of your other books, in this book of the West Georgia murder of Gwendolyn Moore, her husband was also tied to the Dixie Mafia, and he was a cruel person.
To some of the people that were implicated in the Klinkscale.
Mm-hmm. So we can see why that would be one of those theories that everybody felt like was really true, but it ended up not being true.
Like I said, and because of what they had, you know, the information that they gave out, and the leads that they said they had followed, that I developed my own theory about it. I became a victim of that myself. Supposed to have been in a lake, you know, and this, it went from, he's in a drum, put in a lake, and not a single piece of all those things has ever been corroborated.
And they checked everywhere. Everybody checked everywhere,
Well,
from here to Auburn.
And then, you know, year before last, boom, there's a car shows up in the creek down there also.
In the valley.
That's right, and at exit 77.
Mm-hmm.
No, it was 77, it's 7 more.
I'm not sure.
Exit 70, Casita exit.
Yeah, Casita exit. Yeah, definitely Casita exit.
And the car shows up, he's in the car.
Yeah.
DNA proves he's in it. So he's not in a barrel, he ain't buried under the airstrip or the interstate or any of the other many places that people came up and said this happened and this happened and this happened.
Well, we called that the old Ben Brown Road. I don't know what the legit is. Coming off of 29, but it's the old Ben Brown Road. It wasn't off of 29, and I mean I've traveled that road 1,000 times. I mean it's well traveled every day, and all these years, all of us have just driven over him and did not even realize.
And here's the thing, you know, and some of the folks even today, and there are people that, because of their beliefs and ties to the story, that will never believe that this is that I see that it was. And
they don't think he was in that car. They don't think the car was in the.
Oh, they you know, the car was. Well, there's no denying he's in the car.
Right.
And there's some damage to the car that's consistent with it going into that hole at a relatively high rate of speed, you know, highway speed or driving speed, car, the headlights are on, the car's in high gear, and it's in, the switch is on. And, again, and the damage to the front of the car would have been consistent with vaulting over into the hole. And it's been portrayed by some folks that, you know, it just drove down in the creek. Well, that's not the way it was. It was a big barrel culvert, and water came out of the barrel culvert and dug a big hole, probably 6.5, 7 feet deep. And you folks will say, well, there'd be high water and low water, and which is true. But because of that hole being there and it being continuously cleaned by the water, basically like a waterfall, that hole there is there and it remains there. And no matter how high the water got, the level in that pool would never get any lower than the water that came in and the water that went out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that would be, you know, that's just a scientific fact of hydrology. The water comes in, water goes out over a pool, and if the water completely ceased up here, then the pool would remain the same depth.
Yeah.
But as long as it comes in and it went out, and that was a pretty good sized little creek. And
it deceived everybody because you couldn't see the car.
Exactly.
Because it got in that pool.
And the only way it could have got in that pool is either it had to be, it wasn't like the car was dumped off the side and went down. It vaulted off to make it over into where it was.
So you're thinking that he fell asleep at the wheel because it was after work heading back to Auburn. That's a different route. It's just about as short as going down.
Now I will say this. I have talked to 2 different people that said, and these are credible folks, that they had talked to him early that night, and he was going to bring them an ounce of marijuana apiece, and they were students at Auburn at the time. And that would explain why, instead of going down and getting off at the Auburn exit and exposing himself to the Lee County Sheriff's Office, which was right there, the Auburn PD, which would be all over the place, and the University Police, he gets off there and goes in the back way on 29.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can think of. The reason he would have done that, and that's just the way that somebody delivering 2 ounces of marijuana would think.
Yeah.
But there's 100 miles of fishing line on the car when they bring it out.
Really?
Oh yeah, it had the fishing line all over it. But here's the thing, that, you know, and a lot of folks said, well, you know, that car was just put there.
There ain't no way. The way the whole thing's shaped, you couldn't do that. The road and everything.
The length of time that is on the car, it would have been consistent. The only way it was found was the trunk latch eventually just rusted in half. And it was a hatchback, an old Pinto hatchback. And when the lid came up, it's 4 feet taller than the rest of the car, so it stuck up about that high. And some of those folks fishing, so had all that line tangled in. And there was some damage to his skull, but and some folks suspect it of being a bullet hole. And if you look at it, it could have. If you didn't know any better. But because of the curvature of a human skull, when a bullet strikes it, it makes what's known as a keyhole defect. And you can research it on the internet. It doesn't make a round hole. It makes a semi-round hole with a longer place on the back, and that's because the bullet strikes the curvature of the skull and doesn't go straight in. And but again, you can research that on the internet and under keyhole defect, and it'll explain that. And again, this is just what I think, you know, because again, because of what they said they knew, that now that they obviously didn't, I had my own suspicion. I said, because of the tangle of people that were involved and this and that, that were always said to have been, I thought that he would probably be in a lake that was, and there are several things that made me go this way, especially when they said that, you know, what had happened. But I was, again, I had my theory based on what they said was true,
Mm-hmm.
and that theory was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to remember that to all the folks that said, well, that car just recently put there, everybody that was ever alleged to have been involved or known anything about this, they all been dead 20, 25 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So and folks say, well, that car couldn't have been there that long. Well, if it's been there 25 years, who's to say it wasn't there 40?
Yeah.
You know, and again, if you look at where it was and how it was, and like I'm saying, this is just my opinion, but I like to think it's a fairly learned opinion. It's the only person who was ever convicted in conjunction with this case. He wasn't convicted, he pled guilty. And he pled guilty to giving a false statement.
Oh, okay.
And he was questioned time and time and time again over a number of years. And it was one of those situations where he started buying into the theory.
Mm-hmm.
And even on the day that he pled guilty, they asked him, you know, are you pleading guilty because you are in fact guilty? And they had to stop the proceeding and explain to him that it wasn't that he took part in anything, it was that he made a statement that was completely opposite from what he had told 100 times in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that's a lie. It's a lie and a lie, and he got himself caught up in it. You can't.
he did, and and me knowing the guy, I knew the guy, and he's one of those folks that just put himself in the situation, and he started telling folks what they wanted to hear.
Oh,
And that, again, and
people
that's just
shouldn't do that. People, we got to warn you out there. Don't start telling lies. Just get involved in something. It'll backfire on you.
It will, and like I say, he told the story of what he knew or supposedly knew many times, and it was ever evolving, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a situation at some point where on Flat Shoals Creek down off of Salem Road, there was a credit card that belonged to Kyle Klinkscale found, and this was after a long time after he was disappeared. And the theory behind it, I think, probably happened. Mr. and Miss Klinkscale, they did everything in the world. Bless their heart, they both passed away before Kyle's remains were ever found. It got to where they had written a book called Friday Never Came.
Oh, I didn't know
I think it was
that.
Friday. Yeah, they did.
Oh.
And was it Friday Never Came? But anyway, it was one of the days the week that never came, and the following Friday he was supposed to come home from Auburn, and he never showed. So I think that was right. But at one point, you know, a few years after he had disappeared, the thought was that credit card was placed there to reintroduce some interest in the case.
Oh, to keep it going, yeah.
And that may or may, again, all this is just my observation. One thing we do know is that there were about a half a dozen different scenarios that came forth. Not a single one at all has ever been corroborated. The people that would have had that those scenarios put interest in that would have been involved when the remains were found in that vehicle down there, they'd all been dead 20 years.
Yeah.
So the car had been there that long.
Yeah.
And the patina, if you would, on the vehicle is consistent with the amount of aging that it would have been in the position it was in.
So again, what do you think? Do you think he just fell asleep at the wheel?
That'd be my guess.
I think so too.
If you, again, you know, some of the portrayals was like you just drove out in the creek. It's not like that at all. You launched off a bank into that hole.
Mm-hmm.
And
you know what we might do? We might go down there where the car was found one day and video it for everybody so they can kind of
get a
see.
feel for how it could have happened.
Exactly.
And again, you know, I don't pretend to know everything in the world about this case. But if you look at the facts that I see at this point, number one, not one part, you know, he was shot, he was put in a barrel, he was under part of the place out there, they built over him, he was under the interstate, he was put in a barrel with concrete and put in a lake. None of that is true.
Mm-mm.
And as simple as it may seem, if you look at news reports from all over the country, every once in a while, there's a huge disappearance of somebody in where we found, in a body of water that's been covered up forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is very likely to have been the case. Now, do I think some of those associations that he had were capable of getting him in a situation where somebody could have hurt him? Sure, I do. And the guy that was always alleged that he is the person that killed him, the guy that ended up in jail, if the person that was alleged to kill Klinkscale knew for 1 minute that that other guy had witnessed anything like a murder, him murdering somebody, his life wouldn't have been worth a nickel.
That's right. That's right.
But again, you know, there are some folks that for years and years have been just addicted to this case.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll never change what they think about it.
Yeah.
But if you look at the logic in it, it just
it was an
it
accident.
makes sense.
You know, I think it's interesting too that it's always been highlighted. It's always been put in at least the LaGrange Daily every other year or so. It's still mentioned until he was found, and of course it was a big deal written up about it when he was found. But isn't it interesting that it took that latch rusting and that hatchback coming up just enough at that time to be found? That God wanted him found, and they wanted this kind of cleared up to some degree, you know.
Well, I can tell you this: if the latch on that Pinto hadn't rusted in half,
no one would ever found
he'd
him.
still be there.
I believe that to
He'd
be
still be
true. Yeah.
And the tragedy of it all was that Mr. and Ms. Klinkscale, they lost their child. They never knew. They didn't have the peace of being able to bury him with them.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he is now.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another story for another day. But in my opinion, as hard as and again, I had somebody call me yesterday or day before that told me what they knew about the Klinkscale case, and it was totally impossible for it to be what they said.
And especially since now all the examinations have been done of his remains, and you know what happened. You see that he had a head wound, but it's probably just the impact. You know, back then we didn't wear seat belts in the 79.
And you know, cars weren't as safe as they are now.
Especially not a Pinto.
But I will say this, to a layman that looked at the damage on that skull, you say, man, that could be a bullet hole. But it lacked the characteristics of being a bullet hole, and the verbiage, I think, on the skeletal autopsy was the damage that the medical examiner found on the skull was consistent with deterioration in the environment that the skull was in.
Yep.
For 50 years.
That makes sense. Yeah.
You know, so
Mm-hmm.
it's again, to a degree, it's still a mystery.
Yeah.
But sometimes you just have to look at the reality of what you see.
Well, I think I know that road well enough to believe that if you fell asleep right at that certain spot, you were going to go straight into that creek because it's a downhill curve to go across the little bridge, and then you go up a hill. And, you know, I could see how someone could go through there. But, you know, I can't see how someone didn't notice if he took out a couple of small trees, because where I see it now, maybe the trees have just grown up around it. To hit that creek, you'd have to hit a couple of trees to get in it. So back then, it might have been more manicured and everything than it is
you
now.
know, that goes back to that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
We're nearly 50 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you know, trees that were this big 50 years ago, now you can't reach around.
Right,
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
But again, the only way that could have got where it came to rest was either it vaulted off that high bank. Of course, I saw some back when it first found, there was some folks who were questioning about what took place, and it showed the creek, but it didn't show where the hole was. It showed it just below the hole, where you could have got down there and got into the creek, and it looked like it'd have been an easy thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody had pushed the car off that ledge, it would have been standing on its nose.
Exactly. And that'd have been hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Or the most insane thing would be the only other way it could have got there was for a crane or a huge big wrecker like a rotator could set on that bridge and set it over in there. But
that's a well-traveled road. Somebody would have noticed all of that.
That would have never happened.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was all that stuff about, you know, everybody said, you know, the person that was involved in that time was Ray Hyde. That was who it was alleged that had killed him. And Ray Hyde ran a junkyard. And Ray Hyde was convicted of several crimes. And, you know, the only way to say it, he was a kind of a career criminal. He ran a junkyard, and when the feds finally caught him, they had actually they were missing a bunch of specific types of vehicles. And they were stolen around Birmingham, Atlanta, and other cities. And back in that day, it wasn't like today where they could put a GPS monitor on a car. They put those old pings, you know, and they'd ping, and they'd send a aircraft up, and they'd fly around and try to find them. Well, if I'm not mistaken, it was like 90 vehicles that were on that lot that were stolen.
Where was the lot? Where was his lot?
On the Smoky Road down in rural Troup County. And it all fell into, it made sense, you know. Ray was alleged to have been one of the first people in this part of the country to be dealing a fair amount of marijuana, and I expect cocaine too back in the day. And he built him an airstrip down there. He was a pilot. He had him an airstrip down there on the place, and it all made for an urban legend.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I would not be surprised if that's not exactly where Kyle had gotten, you know, was getting the marijuana from.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if there had been anybody there that Ray had knew that story, they wouldn't have left there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
If I had just killed one, what's the difference in me killing two?
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
But
yeah, there's a day that we'll have to talk more in depth about the Dixie Mafia, because that is truly an amazing story.
It was, and they had a big tentacle out of Phoenix City and some up in North Georgia around Cumming, and they were where the New York families worked in conjunction with each other, you know, and this and that. These were like little offshoots of a clandestine outfit here and a clandestine outfit here, and they did communicate and do business in and around each other, but they weren't as organized as they were a little more redneck.
Yeah, but they were deadly. That's
they
for
were
sure.
very deadly, and it ended up with Patterson, who had just been elected. He ran on he was from Phoenix City. He was a war hero, and he ran as an attorney down there. He ran as his platform was, "I will clean up Phoenix City, Alabama." And at that time, Phoenix City, Alabama was Phoenix City before Las Vegas was Las Vegas.
Oh, yes.
Because people came from all over the country there to gamble and do so, you know.
Particularly because of the Fort Benning and all the military soldiers coming in and out. And it was wartime and all that.
At one time, General Patton trained the Third Army at Fort Benning,
Mm-hmm.
and he wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Army at the time that said that it was a total and complete distraction to him training his men for war, and if it was up to him, he'd take a Sherman tank across the bridge at Phoenix City and destroy the town.
Well, he's sending the National Guard. That's the only time
Well-
that was done in a little town like that.
What happened to bringing the National Guard there was Patterson ran and was elected.
Mm-hmm. And
On
he had a short leg, didn't he? He walked with a specialized boot.
He got, it was because it was an injury he got in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And Patterson was elected, and before he could, in his acceptance speech, he made a statement, "I don't think I'll ever live to see." And he was correct.
He knew it.
And he was actually killed when he came out of his office in the afternoon by the chief deputy of the sheriff. And in that particular thing, the chief deputy was indicted. The solicitor of Randolph, not the county that Phoenix City's in.
I'm not sure what county it's in. I know Columbus.
Russell.
Oh, right. Yes,
Russell County,
Mhm.
Russell County, and the sitting Attorney General of the state of Alabama. The Attorney General pled not guilty by reason of insanity and got off. The solicitor was found not guilty, and the chief deputy was found guilty and went to prison for the murder.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those folks that were involved in all that, when that murder actually spurred the governor, because of the political pressure on him, to declare martial law in Russell County and Phoenix City, and it's the only time in American history that martial law has ever been declared.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there was about 50 indictments came out, and they were from a range from commercial gambling to murder that came out of the investigation of the whole thing. And a lot of the folks who were involved dispersed and went to other places, and some of them kept their own way of life and took it with them.
Mm-hmm.
And
But it infringed into LaGrange. It had a little portion here in Hogansville.
Meriwether County,
Mm-hmm.
Chambers County, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
In my first book, first chapter is the snakes crawl up the river.
It's true. It is true.
It is.
You know,
It is.
what I find so fascinating about all this is our day-to-day lives now are so different as far as gangs and criminality. Back then, like you said, it was, I hate to use the word, but it was redneck. It was like you knew who was involved, but you didn't tell because you could get hurt if you told. And it wasn't as, some of it was real cruel, but most of it wasn't super cruel.
Well, look, what they would do is they didn't use, if it came down to it, they'd use the sword, so to speak, to enforce what they wanted. But because they ran everything, they could control whether you had a job or not, whether you could
Exactly.
feed your family or not.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
And
there was some mean ones that they knew that they killed some people.
oh yeah.
And that'll frighten anybody. If they'll kill somebody, or maybe more than one or two people,
You know,
then
that-
you're could be in jeopardy too.
And part of the problem that we have today was people have been desensitized to crime, and a lot of that goes back to the internet and mass media and the television. You know, you see 20 killings a day, and back then, and you got to remember too, back then we probably had a third of the population we have now,
Yes.
and so the numbers are higher, and this abnormally should be.
Mm-hmm.
But I did say that in the Klinkscale case in 2004, the district attorney was contacted and told that the sheriff's office was working Klinkscale's case, and they didn't want me to have anything to do with it. So that was a blessing. I'm glad I wasn't
Yeah.
involved in it.
Yes, because it took a fisherman to find it.
That's exactly right.
Uh-huh.
The greatest criminal minds in the world, they call everybody chasing ghosts, and again, I was one of those. Based on believing that they knew what they said they knew, I had my own grand scheme.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't hold water either.
Yeah, you can't find a case or have a good result of a case unless you have the truth.
Well, and that's the thing about it. And, but again, there was a lot of people that acted on the fact, and part of the reason for that thing, like I say, taking wings and flying, was they said they knew something they really didn't.
Yeah.
And I've said it my entire investigative career, you know, and this was a case of I should have checked myself to make sure that what I was told was right. And but it was believable, you know. But you can't follow your theory.
Right.
Because at that point you start building a case, and the only thing you're looking for is things to support your theory.
Exactly.
And it's just a trap you can fall into.
Oh, you learned that long time ago, and that's why you're so good at what you do now. You follow up with the truth.
Well, yeah, you try to, you know, and sometimes the truth can be disappointing, because
Yes.
sometimes you get to the truth and you can't. I'm working on a couple of cases now, and we're fixing, I think, get some movement on a couple, and but it's hard, you know, especially when they've been looked at over a period of time, and well, there's not enough there, there's not enough there, there's not enough there, and then eventually the pile of evidence just gets so high that, you know, it's overwhelming, and it may be circumstantial, but it's overwhelming. You know, years ago there were no video cameras, there were you know, there wasn't DNA, there wasn't absolution of everything.
And computer paper trails too, now even through the banking system.
Oh God, yes. And I'm working a case now that it involves all those things. And but the truth is, my daddy said this years ago. He said sometimes a case needs to be put in the hands of 12 enlightened jurors, and then let them make that. You know, in criminal law, everything was based on the reasonable man standard. You know, what is reasonable probable cause, what is reasonable in the totality of the circumstance. And we've totally gotten away from that. Things like CSI and all the crime dramas and stuff, and all the technology that's taking place today. And they're wonderful things, but especially when you're dealing with a case that those things weren't there then. You know, just because you don't have DNA to link the suspect to the victim, but you have a ton of other things, you know, well, what are we going to say? That murder or that terrible wrong just wasn't committed, you know, and that, I've got a case now where we're finally fixing to get some traction on it. Case is going to be prosecuted in another county where the murder took place. But early on, all we had was a place here, and then where the body was done. But, you know, at some point in time, we're going to try to use a technicality to say, we can't do that. When, you know, you start talking about people losing their lives and affecting families and heartbreaking things that just go on and on and on forever with families and the people that were been influenced by it. We're just going to look for a reason to not give that a fair hearing. It might have been an old school circumstance, but in the old school, there was heathen folks who committed very serious crimes that they committed. And in all fairness, there's probably some that got convicted of crimes that they didn't commit.
Yep.
But that's
I think that's why the DAs and all want so much more now, that they just won't automatically say yes to something. Bring me a little bit more, bring me a little bit more, you know.
And to be honest, just like you were saying, you're talking about bank records, telephone records, all those things that you have available today. Well, in 1987, you didn't have those things.
No.
You know.
They got thrown in the trash.
1990, you didn't have those things. Most of all those things came on or after around 2000. But does that mean that crimes that were committed before then are any less valuable than the ones that are now.
No, absolutely not. They are very valuable.
So, you know, that's why I kind of try to find some justice for some old cases.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that I do what my daddy taught me, and that was, you know, let the evidence carry the truth about what happened.
It seems to do that,
And
don't it?
don't put your theory in it, because every time I've ever done that, I got bit by it. But, you know, you live and you learn.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I guess that about wraps us up for today.
All right. Well, tell everybody again about your 3 books and where they can get them.
Okay, this is the 1970 murder of Gwendolyn Moore. Happened right here in Hoganville, Georgia. Got a lot of my family and my upbringing in the book. It's a tragic case, of the worst standing case of family violence I've ever heard of in my life. We arrested the husband for her murder, and the next book was a Fred Wilkerson book, and it's a case of a gentleman that fell into the clutches, I can only say, of a black widow that took him for everything he had, and then when that wasn't enough, she killed him. And we convicted her, and she is in prison today. And the third book that's been published is the story of Yang Fovasai, young lady that had just graduated. I say young lady, young girl that had just graduated Union High School. Tremendous story behind how she got here, her and her family. And the serial rapist murderer that killed her, that we were able to convict, and he spent several years in prison before he succumbed to cancer. And currently working on a 4th book. It's the story of Paul McKean Jr. He was a young man that was beaten to death and thrown out on top of Pine Mountain in an attempt to conceal what the truth was with him. And we convicted the folks that were involved in that. And hopefully I can find time, because I went back to work and working on some other cases. Hopefully I can find the time to finish that up fairly in the next little bit. And by then I hope I got a couple more to work on.
Oh, yeah, you will.
So we are plugging right along. But thank you for stopping in with me and Miss Tony. And remember, you can't beat Rogers Barbecue in Hoganville, Georgia.
Thank y'all. And be sure to comment and let us know if there's any questions. We'll get back to you, and we love seeing you every week. We'll catch you on the next time.
Thank you.